Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our next In Conversation. This evening, I'm very proud and privileged to have my good friend, Stephen Norris, ex-Minister of Transport, businessman extraordinaire, chairman of Soho Estates right now, and also chairman of a number of charities, including the Urology Foundation, which is how I got to know Steve so well. Let's start off this session with a question about the now, which is basically COVID-19. Well, Boris rhymes with Norris, but is Boris and his team getting the COVID-19 thing right, or are they barking up the wrong tree?
I think the first thing everybody really appreciates about the current crisis is that no country was really fully prepared. Every country was facing something that, whilst they had sort of acknowledged that it might happen, George Bush was talking about it when he was president, Barack Obama talked about it, Bill Gates talked about it, Mrs. May was asked about it and reassured us all that everything was in hand. The truth is that when it hit, we were in an uncharted territory and every government simply did what it thought was best. And I think it'll take a very long time before we really know how well we did in the UK in comparison to other countries. I think in the early days, what we did was probably exactly the right thing. We went into a lockdown. Whether we could have done a week or so earlier is frankly neither here nor there. We did have a wave, of course, of fatalities, and that wave appears to have receded considerably. Indeed, it has receded considerably. I think, sadly, what's happened recently, and particularly since Boris himself caught the virus and was very much under the weather, is that I just still don't think he's back to the old Boris. There's a sense of drift now. If, for example, the social distancing rule really ought to go from 2 meters to 1, when the WHO and most of the world is on 1 meter, and only we, the Americans and the Spanish, are on 2 meters of all the countries in the world that we know, well, then let's do it. Let's do it now. Don't say, well, we might do it in September. By then, so many businesses will have been devastated by the effects of the virus. And again, when people like the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, say you do realize that this is a massive, massive cost to the economy. We've literally wiped out 20 years of economic growth. We're back to where we were as an economy in 2000. If we can do anything to reboot industry, then we should be doing it. We're not getting that drive from the top that we need to see to say, come on, this is what we're going to do. These are difficult decisions. Because if Boris does announce that we've gone from 2 meters to 1, there will be those who say, are you putting lives at risk? Famously, the doctors will say, well, you know what our advice is. I get all that. But leadership is about saying, I've summed up the arguments, I can see both sides, and this is what we're going to do. And that's what we, sadly, haven't got. Boris has never been very good at making big decisions. I remember, one of the things about him that I knew very, very well when he was mayor is that he didn't read the papers an awful lot, the official papers, I can tell you that. But the other thing was, this sense of saying, do I really have to make a decision? He'd like other people to make them. If it came to him, it often took a very long time to actually get him to say something. And I'm afraid right now, what we do need is decisiveness.
Yeah, and there are rumours there might be a cabinet reshuffle in July. Do you think that's needed? If you were Boris, would you do that?
I would certainly do it. And I just make the point that if you were to look at the current cabinet, what unites them all is loyalty to Boris. This cabinet was picked so that Boris would get through the whole Brexit debate. Remember that? The thing we used to argue about for 3 or 4 years, now hardly mentioned, but nonetheless, it was loyalty, to Boris personally, people who personally committed to supporting him, loyalty to the cause, the Brexit cause, almost without exception. Every minister in the government is solidly with him on Brexit, and that, frankly, is not the best way to run a cabinet. It's not even the best way to run a business. You want some people around who might say, hang on a minute, why don't we think about doing it another way? Why don't we think about this instead? Or maybe even, sorry, you're wrong, and here's why. You know, Mrs. Thatcher was very happy to have people argue with her. She welcomed it. You know, she wasn't saying, I'm right all the time. She says, I'm right. If you think I'm wrong, tell me. And if I listen to you and I think you are right, then we'll do it your way. And there was plenty of evidence that she did it. Boris is currently surrounded by people who say, yes, sir. And actually, that's not good. That's not good for the economy. It's not good for the government. So yes, I think we need to see a reshuffle, and I think we need to see a few people appointed who will perhaps, you know, be prepared to say, come on, we've got to get a decision now. People who will say, actually, I don't think this is necessarily the right way to go. And people who will say, we shouldn't be relying on special advisors, you know, and particularly, you know, special advisors that you and I would probably be able to name, who seem to have more authority than cabinet ministers. That's not the way our democracy ought to work.
Should he have stood up for Dominic Cummings in the way he did, or do you think Dominic should have gone?
I don't. I think that, ironically, what Dominic Cummings did, when you know the full story, was understandable. Whether it broke the rules or not, he claims that it didn't break the rules if you read them very, very carefully, and perhaps he's right. I think what was more relevant was whether he should have just said, look, I made an error of judgment. It was technically within the rules. Perhaps I shouldn't have relied on that as much as I did, but we were feeling pretty desperate. He never once mentioned that his son is severely autistic, for example. I mean, it's maybe improper even for me to mention it, but I think it's relevant. And they were desperate, and you know, they knew that his father had an estate up in Cumbria where his parents occupied one house, his sister occupied another, and they could have a third dwelling to themselves while the sister looked after their son. They, both of them, feeling the effects of COVID. So, you know, I'm not an apologist for Dominic Cummings at all. I think in the sense, however, you know, after that event in the Rose Garden in number 10, it's pretty obvious that there wasn't enough ammunition there to fire him. And so Boris said, I'm sticking with him.
Mm-hmm. Do you think he has too much power over Boris, in view of what you said about Boris still being poorly?
Boris can be perfectly ruthless when he needs to. So if he ever decides that Dominic's more trouble than he's worth, he'll fire him.
Yeah.
I think the key to Dominic Cummings is that he's the person who is the last to speak and the first to speak, if you know what I mean, in any debate. So he's more like the thick of it, you know. He's like the guy who says, look, you're just a Secretary of State, you're just a politician, you know nothing. I'm an analyst, I know things, I understand statistics, I know, you know, the inside story here. So you be quiet while I tell the Prime Minister what he's going to do. That's, I know, what massively irritates elected MPs who say, hang on a minute, that's the difference. We're elected, you're not. No previous special advisors that I can think of had that kind of power. People like Alistair Campbell clearly exercised a great deal of influence over Tony Blair, but not to the extent that Dominic Cummings does over Boris. And do I think that's healthy? No, frankly, I don't.
So, Steve, the other sort of looming issue which people panic about, you know, we've been talking COVID, but, you know, you mentioned Brexit. I mean, this is looming up and it's only 6 months to go. Do you think there will be a deal and we'll get a resolution of this, or are we going to crash out without one?
Oh, I think there'll be a deal. Don't think there's any question about it. And actually, I thoroughly approve of us taking a stance which says, no, we don't need more time. I mean, if famously deals are done in Europe, I mean, I did my own, you know, I had my own veil of tears in terms of going to see the then Transport Commissioner of the European Union, one Neil Kinnock, ironically, when I was minister. You know, the truth is the EU is perfectly capable of doing a deal right now, but both sides are negotiating. And the difference is that this time we have made it clear that we are prepared to walk away if the deal is unsatisfactory. Now, that's something that Mrs. May made it clear she was not prepared to do. I always remember a wonderful interview that ITV did with a market trader in Bolsover on the morning after the election. Out of the mouths of market traders, this guy was approached by the ITN report. How did you vote? And the chap said, I said, I voted Conservative. And he said, would that be how you would normally vote? And the guy said, no, I've always been a Labour voter up to now. He said, do you know what? He said, I voted to leave. And he said, I watched my Labour MPs spend the last 3 years doing everything they possibly could to stop us leaving. This wasn't anti-Jeremy Corbyn, ironically. It was anti-Keir Starmer and his friends, all those Labour MPs who were saying, no, it's a disaster if we leave, and so on and so forth. And whether they were right or not, they certainly weren't looking after their own constituents. And the interviewer was very kind, and he said to this chap, he said, but hang on a minute, Dennis Skinner, your MP, was a Leaver, wasn't he? And the chap said, well, oh yeah, he was a Leaver. He said, but he voted for that stupid Ben Act. And everybody knows that if the other guy knows you can't walk away, he's got you. And I'm thinking, do you know what? It takes a market trader in Bolsover to spell out to an awful lot of very, very bright people, Tories, Liberals, Labour, whatever, that's the point about any negotiation. If the other guy knows you can't walk away, he's got you. And that's what we can't afford to do. So we're taking a pretty strong stance, exactly the right thing to do. Will it be a question of who blinks first? Well, to some degree, yes. We already know that, for example, the EU signalling that they're prepared to, drop their insistence on fisheries. It'll be interesting. There'll be, we'll make some concessions. That's inevitable. But we are making it clear that we are leaving. So, for example, we're not going to be tied to EU rules. In other words, taking the pain without having the gain. If we're going to trade with the EU, it's got to be on terms which are better than Canada, for example. Why would a country like Canada, that's thousands of miles away and sells a very small amount and buys a very small amount from the EU, get better trading terms than from, Europe's second largest economy? And that, of course, is us. So I think there'll be a deal to be done. I think it'll be done at the last. There'll be white smoke at 2 o'clock in the morning or whatever. That's the way these things work, but it'll be done.
Yeah, that's interesting. Steve, let's take you back to the good old days. You're a Liverpudlian. Can't tell that from your accent.
Somebody said to me today, do you come from Liverpool? I said, yeah. I said, I can tell, just the odd word. I said, do you mean like Bath? Because I've always been obsessed with this. If it was Bath, it'd be B-A-R-T-H. It's C-A-T, cat. So why isn't it B-A-T-H, Bath? I mean, if I say I'm going for a bath, everybody says, oh, you must come from Liverpool. I say, well, yeah, there you go.
Tell us a little bit about your school and your upbringing, and then you went on, of course, to Oxford. Just let's go back and a few thoughts about those good old days.
Oh, well, I'll tell you something, Roger. I'm the absolutely classic, very, very fortunate millennial. Born literally. I was around on VE Day. I hadn't actually popped out of my mum yet. That took another couple of weeks. But when she was having a drink and a jig, as she told me, I was probably reminded it was about time to leave, sort of thing, Born in 1945, went to a local primary school, but it was a good school and got the 11 plus. Went to a brilliant grammar school that my father had actually been at. He'd left when he was 15, but by 1955, 56, it was a wonderful, wonderful school. I got an open exhibition to Oxford. Nobody cheered in the school because that year, this school in Liverpool that took everybody from doctors' sons and dockers' sons and, many immigrant children, friends of mine, because Liverpool's always been a very mixed community, and got them into brilliant universities, and so maybe that year, maybe 10 people got into Oxford and Cambridge with either, places or with awards. It didn't feel exceptional at all. And I had a wonderful time at Oxford, read law with one of the best lawyers that this country's ever produced, as it happens, as my tutor. And then, when you've had that kind of education, you don't need any other help. That's what's tragically, as far as I'm concerned, not there now for kids in my city of Liverpool. And actually, it's one of the reasons I got into politics, because the militant tendency, when they took over in Liverpool, destroyed those grammar schools on the grounds that somehow they were elitist, when actually you were there because it was clear you had the ability to go to these great universities, and the system allowed you to nurture it. As it is, of course, now, there's only one school that provides most of the scholarships to Oxford, and that's the private fee-paying school, Liverpool College. I think that's tragic. Anyway, for that I couldn't afford to go to the bar, which is what I was advised to do, because you couldn't get a grant for bar finals, and in those days, pupil masters didn't pay their pupils. They didn't actually charge them anymore, but they certainly didn't pay them, and I didn't have enough money to be able to last for a year or so without earning anything. So I went into selling the precursor to computers, then got a job, saw a job with Ford Motor Company, which really sounded good because they were a great learning experience, a bit like Mars, it's often talked about. I think Mars and Ford were two of the best kind of, universities of business that you could have in those days. And after that, because I was helping other companies to improve their sales ability and their balance sheets, I went to work for a wonderful man called Colonel Ronnie Hoare, part of the Hoare banking family, who used to race D-type Jaguars at Le Mans and Monaco and so on. Wonderful guy. They always said with Ronnie, if he was down to his last fiver, he'd go to Paris to spend it. And he had the idea of starting to sell Ferraris in the UK. Mike Hawthorne had killed himself on the Guildford bypass in a terrible crash. And he was about to start selling Ferrari. So the old man thought he'd go to talk to Enzo in Maranello, and off he went and said, I'll take it on. And so Enzo said, so how many cars will you sell? And Ronnie said, 4. He said, I'll sell 1 to Harry Harms, 1 to Eddie Portman, Lord Portman, 1 to Joe Bamford's, a young lad, Anthony Bamford. And he said, and I'll have the 4th. And that literally was what he did. And Enzo said, that's terrific. So we started Maranello Concessionaires on the Egham bypass. And it's still to this day, nowadays it's sort of used Ferraris and Maseratis. But in those days, it was where we started. It was sort of custom built. I had a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful time, and went on buying my own garages and running them for myself. Had a great time. Then got sidetracked into politics. Desperate mistake, one of the biggest mistakes I ever made.
What was it that triggered that? Because you were involved in a local council first, weren't you?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what it was, funny enough. This sounds very, very twee, but I promise you it's true. Being a kind of Kennedy generation, who massively admired John Kennedy, we remembered the things he said, like, ask not, what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And he had another line, which to me was even more powerful, which was, if not now, when? If not me, who? And I remember thinking, that's really powerful. And I came across the amount of money that our local county council spent. And I also knew that there was a vacancy for a county councillor after our local county councillor, because we lived in Berkshire at the time, was retiring. I didn't rate the other 2 people. And I remember saying to my wife, God, look who's standing, it's Fred and Bill or whatever. Bloody useless. And she said, I don't know why you do that. I took the hind leg off a donkey. You should do that. I remember thinking, if not who, if not me, who, if not now, when, give it a go, have a go. So I did, and I got elected. And
was that Oxford North, your first?
No, this was Berkshire County Council in 1977.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed it. I sort of started to take it over, which is, I'm afraid, a tendency of mine. It's not my best characteristic, but really enjoyed it. And in 1983, by then, sort of having been drawn into politics, I got an invitation to stand in Oxford East, which was the newly created half of Oxford that nobody, me included, expected the Tories to win.
Right.
And it was 1983. That was the year Mrs. Thatcher won everything, you know, a bit like Boris the other day, or Tony Blair in 1997. It's when you get that big swing, you know, where the most unlikely seats go the way nobody expects. And Oxford East was one of them. And stone me, you know, got elected. That was a bit of a problem, really. I remember having to ring up the guy that was running my garages business, and it's about 1 o'clock in the morning. I said, "Here, Tony, got a problem." And he said, "What's that?" I said, "I've won." He said, "Oh, go to bed, for God's sake. Don't give me that." And I said, no, I promise you, I've won." He said, "Are you kidding?" I said, "No, put the telly on, you'll see. It says Oxford East, Congain." And sure enough, it was, you know. And so that caused a bit of consternation. Anyway, suffice to say, I enjoyed it enormously. About 2 years in, I was asked to be parliamentary private secretary to Willie Walgrave in the Department of Environment, which in those days looked after local government, and I kind of knew the local government scene pretty well. Enjoyed that hugely. Lost in 1987. But, you know, funnily enough, I was probably the least upset of anybody in the Tory party that night, because I kind of knew that when you'd got a wafer-thin majority, because I'd only ever had a majority of 1,000, it probably was going to happen sooner or later. It's the kind of thing that happened to Chris Patten, if you remember, in Bath, when John Major won in 1992, but Chris lost, and that's because it was always a very, very marginal seat.
Right.
I said, fine, went back to the business, didn't really think much about it until about 18 months later, when a friend of mine said, "You know, I live in Epping Forest, and you know that John Biggs Davison's died. You should stand for that seat. You know, you'd really enjoy it." Now, I knew that John had a majority of 20,000, which is, you know, where the old line is always, we don't count them, we just weigh them, you know, I mean, you're going to win. But it would have been a by-election, and by then the Tories weren't particularly popular, I can tell you that. So I said, yeah, okay, fine. And cutting a long story short, won it and stayed there for the next decade and really loved it. Had a great time. You know.
What was it like working with Maggie then? Was she?
Oh, she was terrific.
That bloody woman, didn't they?
Well, you see, the key to Margaret was that she was a real, she was a force of nature. That's the first thing. You know, she had enormous personality, and you know, not everybody would have appreciated it. I did. I never found her particularly scary, for example. She was always very nice. I suspect the lower you were down the pecking order, the nicer she was. In fact, 1 or 2 times I found that out. But in the early days, you take things like reforming the trade unions. She would say, "We've got to do this." And the wets, as she called them, Jim Pryor, even, you know, so people like, Willie Whitelaw and so on would say, "Oh, I don't know about that, Margaret. It would be very, very difficult." And she said, no, I'm going to do it. It'll work. And of course, she was right. And she drove things through in those early days because she said, "I know what I'm doing and it's going to work." And again, whatever you think of her, whether you approve of what she did or not, she was transformative in terms of our reputation, in terms of our personal self-confidence. You know, as a nation, we felt, if you like, we felt like a world power again. Falklands, of course, classically added to that enormously, particularly to the win in 1983, and it swept her along. But toward the end, she'd lived in the bubble of Number 10 and Chequers and international travel to meet world leaders and convoys. You know, in other words, wherever you went, you had a police car in front and 6 motorcyclists with flashing blue lights and a convoy of people behind you. She'd never been in a queue. She'd never gone into a shop and had to queue in a shop. She'd never been on a train and just bought a ticket. She'd never been on a bus in 10 years and whatever. And it kind of meant that she started to dislocate from that wonderful kind of basic understanding of what people were feeling. Probably best example of that was, of course, the introduction of the community charge, now known to everybody as the poll tax.
Yeah.
A lot of logic behind it, but it was never going to sell. The public were never going to buy it. And if she'd been the old Margaret, I think she'd have sensed that. But as it was, don't do that, Margaret. I can and I will. She could not. That was the tragedy. And in the end, I've written this, I wrote it, not long after. I voted for Michael Heseltine in the first round of that election that said goodbye to Margaret, because I thought by then, yes, there was what we call the TBW factor, that bloody woman. That was staying on the doorsteps in seats like mine, not just in marginal seats or Labour seats. They were saying it in Tory seats as well. Oh God, she's gone on too long. It's always, it's interesting. We've never had term limits in the UK in politics. You don't need them. 2 terms, probably ideal. 3 terms, that's fine. When you've been in power, as she had been, from 1979 to 1990, that's a very long time for a single individual.
Yeah.
And people say, enough already, let's have a change. And so, John Major emerged in 1990, and the rest of my political time was spent in this government.
Yeah. Was he the right man? I mean, I always thought Heseltine was a bit of a star. I would have voted for Heseltine myself, but maybe he would.
Matthew Paris coined a phrase, which was that he who wields the dagger will never wear the crown. I think he got it from some historic figure who'd first used the words, but that was Michael's problem, you see. I voted for him in the first round, but I didn't vote for him in the second round because I recognized that he had outraged half the party, and that had he won and become Prime Minister and leader of the party, he would have caused enormous division. What was now important, now that Margaret had gone, and many, I would say the majority of ordinary Tory members, maybe not voters, but members, were in mourning, it was kind of important that we got somebody who could heal. And John Major was probably the best of the 3 candidates to do that. Douglas Hurd, Michael Heseltine, John Major. So yeah, we probably got the right person for the time. And there are many people who say that in 1992, when Major fought the election at the end of that 5-year term for the Tories, that actually nobody else would have been able to win for the Conservative Party, that Margaret would not have won. Well, that's an open question, we'll never know. But it's not an unreasonable proposition.
Sure.
Of course, he then went for another 5 years.
So under John Major, you were Minister of Transport, and I think your lasting achievement there is the Jubilee Line, isn't it, Steve? The
extension of the Jubilee Line into Docklands. It was what now Docklands absolutely relies on, and of course it's going to get Crossrail, which I also championed, less successfully in that case, but I absolutely bet the house on persuading the Treasury that really didn't want it. I promise you, did not want it, that we should build the Jubilee Line extension into Docklands, because it was so obvious to me. It wasn't just about what it would do for Canary Wharf and Docklands, although what it did do astonished even me. It was what it could do for places like Bermondsey, Canada Water, for the Greenwich Peninsula, for West Ham, for Stratford. Those are the places that desperately needed it, just as much as Canary Wharf needed a link to the city and a link into the West End. And it was that classic case of knowing that if you build it, they will come. Mm-hmm. Of course, said, we don't need it. Life's fine. Everybody's getting it wrong. They haven't got it. They won't miss it. They don't miss it. They haven't got it. Well, yeah, you can play that card. I think it's now an openly understood fact of life that the British, from the 40s all the way through to probably the Cameron government, was very, very bad at infrastructure.
Yeah.
If you take, for example, Crossrail, Labour were very critical of the Tories for not proceeding with it, and I, of course, privately agreed with them. But when Labour came in 1997, it still took them a decade to even begin to get the project started, and that was only because Ken Livingstone by then was absolutely beating them up on the issue and saying, come on, you've got to do this. And of course, he was absolutely right. He did for Crossrail what I was lucky enough to be able to do for the Jubilee Line. So yeah, I'm very proud of it. I'm genuinely proud of it. And I always will be, because I get on those trains, used to get on those trains, and even at 11 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they're rammed. Yeah. If anything, we need more of them, not less of them. And goodness knows what would have happened to that whole area if it hadn't been built.
So 1997 loomed up, and I guess Tony Blair was there. I mean, what influenced your decision to leave politics?
I knew he was going to win. It was blindingly obvious. I mean, we had then been in for 17 years when I told the Prime Minister that I wasn't going to stand at the next election. It was so obvious. We were tired. I remember a cabinet minister who's a good friend, so I won't mention his name, but who said around the table one day, well, maybe people don't like it, but that's because they don't understand. And he'd been used to saying that. We'd won in 79, 83, 87, 92, you know, this had broken all the records. And I think he'd forgotten that you've got to listen to people in the end. You've got to listen. And we had stopped listening. Major was being given the runaround by a young, very articulate, very focused Tony Blair, originally, of course, by John Smith, who didn't make life comfortable for John either, but John Major, and then by Blair. And, you know, it was so obvious. Blair could take millions of votes from people who would otherwise perhaps have voted Tory. And as you know, Blair, in his rather cynical approach to politics, was always focused on what do people want, I'll give it to them. And which is why he's the only Labour leader to have won 2 terms, never mind 3. So I knew we were going to be out for about 10 years. I was, whatever it was at the time, what would I have been in 96? I would have been 51. And I thought, look, you don't make any money at all in politics. And that's a good thing, of course, in many, many ways, but nonetheless, when you've got a mouth to feed and children to put through school and all the rest of it, I decided that I would leave. And there's another reason, really. I've always been in politics to change things for the better, if you can. I've always recognized that in politics, you can't instantly say, you know, be reasonable, do it my way, because that's not how the system works. It frustrates a lot of business people who do go into politics, and many of them last for a couple of years and then go. But no, I understood it and I enjoyed it. But it was because I, in the end, could make a difference, could deliver something like, say, the Jubilee Line extension or whatever. I didn't fancy being in opposition, just trying to think of ways to say that things that I probably agreed with privately were somehow wrong. It just wasn't for me. It's just not, I just don't like that kind of life. So I left, went back into business, and that's where I've been ever since. But with a close eye on my colleagues and my office, which is where I am now, is literally, just as we were starting this, I saw Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, pass the window because he's on his way for his office around the corner. I see colleagues every day. Often, you know, they'll look up at my window and say, you know, I see, yeah, that's a cup of tea with a cabinet minister or an old friend. So I still keep my hand in, but I don't want to get elected to anything. I want to help deliver things. I did it for the Labour government.
Question, Steve. There's one from John Rye. He says, we've just celebrated 20 years of the Croydon tram link. Why can't we have trams running down the King's Road, Oxford Street, or even Wimbledon High Street, where I am right now? Any thoughts about trams and other forms of kind of different ways of transportation?
Yeah, well, I was the author of the Croydon tram link, as John may recall, back in the day when Croydon was Tory controlled, and I was told, don't worry, Minister, it won't cost the government anything. We'll raise all the money locally. Well, that didn't actually happen. It cost the government £130 million at the time, and that's probably double that amount of money now. Couple of things. Tram schemes work incredibly well in some cases, but they need generally to work where you can remove substantial amounts of other traffic. You look at European cities, this is where it works best. So whether it would be right down the King's Road, I'm not entirely sure. Do I think there are other places, Oxford Street being one, where you could have some sort of tram system? Yes. But if you think about Oxford Street, a lot of people say, well, why don't we just run the tram system up and down Oxford Street? And the practical issue, which John, I'm sure, will appreciate, is that you have to marshal the trams somewhere. You have to have somewhere where you can regularly maintain them, where you can turn them, where the drivers can, get out and relax and go to the loo and whatever. So there's a lot more to the system than would be just going down Oxford Street. Now, you might take it all the way out to Shepherd's Bush to the west and take it all the way through to the city in the east, maybe somewhere around the old corporation. But it's a much more complex job. And with the advent of Crossrail, of course, and buses in Oxford Street, I think the general assumption now is more about taking other traffic out, but not necessarily putting a light rail system in. But I'll give you an example, for example, just one that John may also appreciate, which is going from Woolwich town centre to the Jubilee Line on the Greenwich Peninsula, goes through the whole of that area of Charlton Riverside, where there's enormous development opportunities, where you could literally house thousands of people. And actually what you would then desperately need is some form of light rapid transit, as it's called, LRT, from, say, somewhere like Woolwich into the Greenwich Peninsula to link up to the Jubilee Line. That sort of project, definitely, I'm a big fan of. Onto Barking Riverside. I mean, don't get me started, actually, otherwise we'll be here till midnight.
What's the delay on Crossrail? Because everybody's looking forward to that opening up. Do you know why?
Yeah, I mean, it's two things. One, there was a technical issue to do with integrating the signalling system with the trains, and that's slightly complicated by the fact that you're dealing with Network Rail's systems on both sides of the central tunnel and a separate system inside the tunnel, which operates obviously in a very, very different way. That caused us some delay, but the reality is that those who believed that the civils works were complete, or gave the impression that they knew they were complete, were simply fooling themselves. If anybody, they were certainly fooling us, because it was pretty obvious to some of us who knew the inside story, if you like, that Bond Street Station, for example, was nowhere near ready to open. It's only coming to the point where it's ready to open now. That, for example, Whitechapel Station was clearly not ready to open. I'm a director of Excel out in East London, and the Custom House station there still isn't completed in terms of the civils works. So, bluntly, if they'd said it will open in early 2022, I suspect people would have said, fine, we'll just get on with it. As it is, I think they made a too ambitious target for opening, and frankly, then missed it. Of course, what they did was, for quite a long time, reassure the mayor, whether it was Boris or whether it was Sadiq, to say, yeah, it's fine, don't worry. And I wonder who was fooling who down the line, because it clearly wasn't ever going to be ready on time if you go by the original date. It'll probably open in the first, there are some trains running on the extremities, but the central tunnel and the full system will probably be open about second quarter 2022, I would say.
Right.
Maybe earlier, maybe halfway. It's between Q2, Q3 21 and, Q1 of 22. It's that kind of time scenario.
There's another question actually from Guy Kenyon. He says, would you build HS2?
Definitely. Well, I'll tell you what I would build.
Yeah.
Everybody, I think, appreciates that one of the fundamental issues around the UK is inequality between London and the southeast, particularly London and, if you like, the home counties, and the rest of the country in terms of costs, values, employment prospects, pretty much everything. And so Boris calls it levelling up, now that the Tories are the party of the northern working class. Actually, if you remember, it was the former Chancellor who said, that he believed in the Northern Powerhouse, what George Osborne called the Northern Powerhouse. And he was right, there's 10 million people there between Liverpool and Hull. That's a conurbation, if you like, as big as London. And whilst nobody's saying that you're going to absorb all these cities into one and call it, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, of course they'll have their own identities, but the ability to trade with each other, to be able to move quickly between each other and so on, and much more conveniently, remains enormously powerful. And the great thing about HS2, particularly the link that goes from London to Birmingham to Manchester, is that it is that opportunity for Birmingham and Manchester in particular. I'll come on to Leeds in a moment, but for those cities to be able to benefit from offering the kind of opportunity to London-based businesses to be able to move the back office from paying, for example, where I am, it's about £65 a foot for commercial space, and in Liverpool it would be £20 a foot. In Manchester it would be £25 a foot, Birmingham £25 a foot. And where the PA who might cost a business, say £45,000 in London, will cost £30,000 in Manchester or Birmingham. So this is about levelling up. And we've seen big businesses, you know, HSBC took 1,000 people to Birmingham, Full Credit took 350 people some time ago to Manchester. Many of the big law firms and the accountancy firms have, you know, an office in London, of course, but they're doing a lot of the grunt work in the north of England. And HS2 adds to our capacity. It's not about speed so much, it's about capacity to be able to make that transfer between those big cities greater. What I probably would not do is build the Whybut that goes from Birmingham through a place called Towton. I'm sure you know where Towton is?
Not exactly.
Yeah, no, I'm not surprised because most people don't.
Yeah.
And the reason is it's the middle of nowhere. It's equally inconvenient for Derby, Nottingham and Leicester. And I'm not sure it makes any sense to go from Birmingham to Leeds that way, because if you build the northern powerhouse link between Manchester and Leeds,
yeah,
but that at the moment there's supposed to be an express train, called an express train, that does that journey. Takes an hour to do 40 miles. That's not my definition of an express. Once you've got that link turned into an express link, then the quickest way to get to Leeds will be London, Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds. You don't have to stop in Manchester. It'll be a quicker journey than going, you know, the way that's suggested. So if you're in Birmingham and you want to get to Leeds, you can always go via Manchester much more quickly. And I don't think the economic benefit of that Y through the Midlands up to Leeds that way actually makes a lot of sense. So basic HS2, definitely. Quicker the better.
So Steve, I want to get on to the charity things that you do. They're really interesting and important, but just tell us a little bit about Soho Estates, because that's a really interesting project as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Business project,
Well,
you know, Soho.
Founded, of course, by Paul Raymond, who
sure.
money, amazing money, recognizing that, you know, sex always sells. And, you know, he was brilliant at it. He had a running battle over decades with Mary Whitehouse, the champion of, you know, of morality, and at least her definition of morality. And he played her off the park, to be honest, not least because he made his daughter, who was the apple of his eye, the managing director of Raymond Publications, which was by then where he was really coining in enormous amounts of money in the 60s and the 70s out of publications, out of the top shelf books or whatever, big magazines and whatever, which, you know, I remember perfectly well. I read most of them like most kids did. That was about as close as you ever got to that kind of photography, if you like, whatever you want to call it. Anyway, the point is that he made his daughter the chief executive managing director. And whenever Mary Whitehouse said, how appalling this degrades women, it's, what do you mean degrades women? My daughter's the chief executive. She does a great job. She does. Anyway, cutting a long story short, he used the massive proceeds to buy property in Soho. And over the years, he assembled what is now familiarly known as 60 acres of Soho. It's virtually all shops, clubs, pubs, bars, restaurants, theatres, cinemas, the odd hotel. And of course, it's a unique place. We try to preserve the spirit of Soho. We don't want to kill it. My motto, since I became chairman many years ago, is edgy, not sleazy. There's nothing amusing or likable about sleaze, about, you know, about drug dealing on the street, about protection money, racketeering, about girls who, as far as I'm concerned, can ply the trade however they like, but being abused, forced to conceal stolen goods, to launder money, and so on, to hide drugs. I mean, that's the kind of thing that was really not nice. And we have no part of that. But what we want to do is to try and make the place different, keep it somewhere where you would want to come. Right now, we're having a tough time. We've lost 9 businesses, already gone bust. It's hit us incredibly hard. I mean, virtually all of our premises are closed. Because we're a family business, we can survive this. We'll be around in 100 years. I've no doubt about that. But it's tough. And, you know, so we're right at the heart of, first of all, a campaign to pedestrianise some of the streets of Soho so that we can get our restaurants and bars to be able to put tables on the pavement and, you know, at least do some business. That's why going from 2 meters to 1 in social distancing terms would make an enormous difference to us. It's be transformative. And more to the point, not to us, because we're merely the landlords. I mean, it's for the businesses themselves. And so, God knows, please do that tomorrow, Boris. It won't be soon enough. It's a great place. It'll come back. It'll be there. You know, we'll be around for a long time, and we're trying to keep as many of our tenants as happy as we can. We know they can't pay. No point in throwing them out. What do you do with the empty building? They're decent people, the vast majority of them. They're facing a terribly hard time. They're furloughing staff, making people redundant. And as I say, some of them just going bust, just throwing the towel in. And it kind of epitomizes to me that point we were making earlier about the damage. I know, you know, COVID kills 42,000 people out of a population of 66 million, you know, less than 0.1% of the population at the price of, you know, 20 years of economic growth. And instead of 3 in 100 being out of work, we're now talking about more than 1 in 10 people being out of work. And that's just devastating. Yeah,
and it's going to take a hell of a long time to recover. Of course, the RSM itself is affected because we've had to close our building down, and that's why we're doing this online session now. Steve, let's change the topic a little bit because, you know, your charity work's important, and that's how you and I got together, as I mentioned, through TUF, the Urology Foundation, and you're doing some work with the Royal National Institute for the Deaf. All right.
Branded action on hearing loss.
Yeah. Tell us, what is it about the charity work? I mean, you're a chairman of a board, and I know that charity boards don't always work brilliantly well. So just give us your thoughts about the charity sector and how we could improve things there. A lot of medics are involved in charities, and a lot of them charities don't work that well, I think, as businesses.
I think a lot of charities, I mean, we've got too many charities, that's the first thing. I think in the medical field, there are 2,800 medical charities, often established after a terrible tragedy, a child lost, a life lost of somebody far too young, whether from prostate cancer, which of course was your particular field, or whether from, you know, heart failure or infant cot death or whatever, you name it. And many, many people have, as if you like, a way of somehow trying to come to terms with their loss, founded a charity and raised money from people who are sympathetic and who maybe even understand the cause and want to help the cause. But what tends to happen is that charity trustees, well-meaning as they are, in the end, are doing their work, if you like, voluntarily, as a favour. And often what it means is that nobody's actually driving the charity, you know, Nobody's actually pushing it forward. You were very good at that. You were hugely good at that. And I tried to make sure that a charity board does actually operate like a public company board, you know, where people are accountable to those people who give us their money and accountable to the people who we say we aim to improve their lives. And to me, I mean, I'm interested in the RNID because I've suffered from partial deafness since I was sort of a child, literally since, discovered first at primary school, literally when I was 5. And I know that deafness affects millions of people to varying degrees, and that it's utterly hidden. You know, blind people can be seen to be sightless. Disabled people who need a wheelchair are pretty obviously, you know, in need of assistance on occasions and support and understanding on others. Deaf people, well, it's one of the few afflictions that can actually make people quite angry, you know, when they sort of shout at you when you say for the third time, sorry, I didn't catch that. And it's terrible. It's also, I'm assured by our scientists, one of the few, if you like, disabilities that is actually curable, that we will eventually be able to ensure is eliminated. And, you know, could be done within our lifetime. So to me, you know, driving that work forward, improving the ability to people who do suffer severe, you know, hearing loss, to be able to communicate with the outside world, and not by using sign language. What that does is it reinforces the sense of isolation, because the only people you can communicate with are other people who are deaf and who understand sign language. But actually using, you know, the cochlear implants that can actually give even people with very severe hearing loss some opportunity to engage with the rest of the world. And to me, that's a fantastic thing if we can do it.
Well, the RSM's got 2 ENT sections, and that's exactly the work that
yeah, brilliant stuff.
Steve, I know you're proud of your sports charity out in Bermondsey. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think that's a fantastic story.
Oh, well, for me, if you said, what's your real sort of, you know, mission in life? It's urbanism. I'm an urbanism expert. That's what I'm supposed to be. You know, that's understanding the link between transportation, property, infrastructure, and how they affect people, the quality of people's lives. I mean, in the next decade, 70% of the world's population will live in cities, and we have to understand what makes them work. And one of the things that you have to deal with in cities is the sense in which the gap between the haves and the have-nots will result in far too many cases in crime, affecting not only those who are the victims, but those who commit it and who may then find themselves incarcerated and the rest of their lives blighted by that conviction on their record. So after that little rather pious homily, the point is, in the 80s, I founded a charity for Douglas Hurd called Crime Concern, which is now called Catch 22, and one of the largest crime prevention charities in the country. I'm very proud of the work that we started and that's still going 30, 40 years later. I've always believed that if you could spend half the money that we add extra to police budgets to helping young people stay away from crime, how much better would society be? What we do at the moment is we spend far too little on trying to help young people to stay out of crime. And as a result, then spend a lot of money arresting people after they've committed offences. And as I say, blighting their lives and the lives of their victims. So youth, you know, crime prevention, which is what Crime Concern was all about, and what the London Action Trust, which I chair for a number of years, was all about, is at the heart of, you know, a charity I absolutely love called New Bermondsey Sports Foundation. You can, if you're interested, you can Google it. What we do is from the generosity of one of the developers in the area called Renewal, who've got a big development scheme going on, they've given us a wonderful warehouse, which we've converted to be able to run 2 full-size basketball courts and about 16 table tennis tables. And so we run basketball and table tennis for youngsters in the area, in the Old Kent Road, Bermondsey, you know, Canada Water, Surrey Canal kind of area, still one of the most deprived places in the entire country. Very poor stats on life expectancy, single parenthood, juvenile crime, you know, juvenile delinquency of all sorts. And where we get 2,500 visitors every month these days, rising to 3,000, and where our basketball teams now, London Thunder, our basketball team, is producing people who play for England, winning national championships. We've got teams from 10 all the way through to under 19s. And in table tennis, London Fusion, our table tennis teams are doing brilliantly well. And you know, the really important thing about this is that those people learn self-respect. They're doing something good. And it's great to feel that and have people say, you did really well, you're terrific, really well done, played really well. It teaches them about teamwork. It teaches them about collaboration, about, you know, being part of a team doing something useful. And they get enormous, not only pleasure out of it, but of course, it gives them something that allows them not to just stand on street corners, as some of their less fortunate colleagues will end up doing, and inevitably getting drawn into, you know, being given drugs for free. That's how the drug dealers always start. And then, God knows, getting themselves into some really dangerous stuff. So, yeah, if you ask me which of them is the one I enjoy most, it's the New Bermondsey Sports Foundation. It's absolutely fabulous, it really is.
I suppose that plays into Black Lives Matter, because a lot of the people, all the tall guys a lot of them come from African or Caribbean origins, I suppose.
Well, I mean, in that area, we have a pretty you know, mixed community out there. We've got you know, got children from every possible ethnicity. But you're right, yeah. I mean, that's one of the issues. I mean, it is certainly my experience that something we dealt with a lot in the London Action Trust was the sense that young Black people have, and which was expressed not only here and in the US, but around the world, in Paris and elsewhere, that just the color of their skin means that they're treated differently. You know, John Sentamu, the retired, you know, Archbishop of York, when he was Bishop of Stepney, you know, got stopped in the car several times by policemen, only because, you know, he's a Black person driving a big car. What's a Black man doing in a big car? And that's unforgivable. And what's more, it's utterly, utterly stupid. And if we do want to, you know, drive deep divisions in our society, that's the way we'll go about it. So, look, nobody that I know supports the violence that followed the recent, you know, the recent events in Minneapolis. But I have to say that it is about time we perhaps took these issues more seriously. And if you wanted to make a practical difference, apart from saying to yourself, yes, of course, all lives matter equally, and Black lives should matter as equally as other lives. And in this country, if you're realistic about it, you know in your heart of hearts that they don't. Then what can you do about it? And one of the things you can do is to take many many young people out of the Black community who feel that the world's against them almost from the start. They know they're going to get stopped and searched. You know, they know that they're going to be asked, you know, why are you in this shop? Asked to open their bags when young white kids of the same age are not asked to do that sort of thing. And if you can just, in a sense, instill in them a sense of pride in themselves, of self-worth, show them how they can operate just as well, just as brilliantly in every field as the rest of the community, then I think you're doing something really valuable for them. We used to run, in the London Action Trust, we used to run a series of programs in prisons, which were about getting young Black men to be able to say hello. As in, hello, hi. Put your hand out, not hello, because we're looking to one side and, you know, not being very comfortable and mumbling and so on, you know. I mean, it's something that's sort of almost taken for granted, and yet you'd be amazed how long it took to change those behaviors, to get those young people to realize the value of being able to get a job. Because one way you can get a job and the other way you probably won't. And you'll say, that's because I was Black. And I will say, well, it was also because you couldn't really say hello. Now, there may be people watching this thinking, what the hell's he on about? But I promise you, that's very serious. I mean, that is literally how we need to be intervening so much more. And it's not about nick a car, win a holiday. It's not about treating people easy. I'm not saying we don't, you know, need to teach some people that there is a bad consequence from committing crime. But it's so much more about investing. I would literally take 10% of the current police budget and put it into youth crime prevention. Not because I have any problem with the police service, but because the problem is that you've got to shut the gate before the house is bolted and not afterwards.
Steve, we better wind up there. Steve actually has helped me motivate young doctors. I remember memorably we did that down in Barcelona, didn't we, a few years ago? Had a nice time doing that. So you can see that Steve is a fantastic motivator, not only of doctors, but of young people. And what an amazing career, what an amazing life. So I have a few announcements. Firstly, to say thank you to you, Steve. Secondly, to ask you to join us again next week. We have our Vice President, Susie Walton, will be talking to Vicky Haywood next Wednesday at 7 o'clock. Tomorrow, we have our COVID-19 series ongoing, and we're discussing the obstetric issues surrounding COVID and how they are influenced by that disease. And tomorrow night, we have our second virtual wine tasting session with the amazing Jane McQuitty and David Gleave from Liberty Wines. So we're tasting 2 delicious Sicilian wines tomorrow. So do join us. And remember, the RSM is a charity. We've been talking about charities this evening. With our building closed, we are short of funds to do these kind of sessions and the educational work that we do. So if you feel like making a donation, we would absolutely love that. But good night for now. And thanks again, Steve. You are a star.